Chapter 1. The Night the Pug Came to Town. Briar Hollow was drunk on its own charm, steeped in the syrupy glow of cinnamon, cider, and the kind of smug, small-town safety that made people forget what lurked in the dark. The Halloween festival was in full swing, the town square a chaotic swirl of flickering jack-o'-lanterns, sticky-fingered kids darting between booths, and teenagers sneaking drags of stolen cigarettes behind the corn maze, their laughter sharp and reckless. The air was thick with the scent of fried dough and burnt sugar, the kind of night where everyone pretended the world was good and nothing bad could touch them. A blood moon hung low, fat and red, like a wound in the sky, but nobody looked up. They were too busy stuffing their faces, oblivious to the hunger watching them from below. Under the creaking wooden stage at the center of the festival, Snort crouched in the shadows, his glowing orange eyes like twin embers in the dark. His wheezy snorts echoed off the damp earth, a low, guttural rhythm that pulsed with barely contained malice. The pug's compact body was tense, his curly tail twitching like a coiled spring. He'd been waiting for this moment all year, biding his time, letting the town fatten itself on false comfort. Tonight wasn't just Halloween, it was a fucking harvest, and Snort was the reaper. Beside him, Nacho was a barely contained explosion of insanity. The wiry Chihuahua was vibrating with manic energy, his bugged-out eyes darting wildly as he paced in tight circles, claws scraping the dirt. His patchy fur stood on end, and his tongue lolled out like he was already tasting the chaos to come. "I'm so fucking ready!" he screamed, his high-pitched growl shredding the quiet under the stage. He spun in a frenzy, tail whipping so hard it looked like it might snap off, until he tripped over his own legs and face-planted into the dirt with a muffled thud. He popped back up instantly, unfazed, his grin wide and deranged. "Let's start with the fat guy with the corn dog. I want to rip his fucking throat out and shove that corn dog down his fuckhole. Fuck yeah, Snort, let's do this!" Snort shot him a sidelong glance, his jowly face set in a scowl. "Patience, you psychotic little shit," he growled, his voice low and gravelly, like rocks grinding together. "You don't just charge in like a rabid squirrel. We wait until they're so deep in their own bullshit they don't see us coming." Nacho's eyes bulged even wider, practically popping out of his skull. "Distracted? Dude, they're eating pies! Fucking pies, Snort! This is the perfect time! This is their death meal, man! Their last supper!" He let out a shrill cackle, bouncing on his paws like a wind-up toy about to break. "I can smell their fear already. Well, okay, that's just ketchup. But still!" Snort's tail twitched irritably, his patience fraying. "Shut your lipstick pleaser, Nacho. I want them all screaming at the same fucking time. You rush this, you ruin the art of it." He licked his chops, his tongue dragging over sharp, unnatural teeth that glinted in the dim light filtering through the stage slats. Above them, the crowd roared with laughter as some idiot kid sprayed whipped cream across the pie-eating contest table. Snort's eyes narrowed. "Soon," he muttered, more to himself than to Nacho. "Real fucking soon." Nacho whined, pawing at the ground like he was trying to dig through it. "You're killing me, Snort. My bloodlust is like physically painful. I need to tear something apart. I need to feel the squish." He snapped his jaws at the air, teeth clacking. "Come on, just one little nibble. That guy with the cowboy hat looks like he'd scream real pretty." Snort didn't bother responding, his focus locked on the chaos above. The pie-eating contest was hitting its peak, the crowd cheering as contestants shoved their faces into blueberry and pumpkin pies, smearing purple and orange across their chins. The mayor, a sweaty, red-faced man in a cheap suit, was waddling around the table, slapping backs and bellowing encouragement. Snort's lips curled back in a sneer. "Pathetic," he muttered. "They're practically begging to be gutted." Nacho froze, his ears perking up. Wait, is that the signal? Is it time? He started hopping in place, his tiny body trembling with glee. Say it, Snort! Say it's time! Snort's eyes gleamed, and he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It's time. Nacho let out a banshee-like screech and bolted for the edge of the stage, but Snort's paw shot out, pinning him by the scruff. Not you, dumbass. Me first. He waddled forward, his stocky frame moving with surprising menace. The boards creaked as he hauled himself up through a gap in the stage, emerging right in the center of the pie table, his glowing eyes cutting through the haze of festival lights. The crowd's cheers faltered, then turned to confused laughter. A pug? On the table? Some kid pointed, giggling, and an old lady cooed, "Oh, look at the cute doggy!" Snort's hackles rose, and he bared his teeth, letting out a low, guttural snarl that didn't belong to any dog. The laughter died. "Laugh while you can, assholes!" he roared, his voice deep and wrong, like it was clawing its way out of a grave. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow, freezing them in place. A woman dropped her cider mug, and it shattered on the ground. The mayor's mouth hung open, pie crust crumbling from his lips. Then Nacho exploded from under the table like a fucking missile. The Chihuahua launched himself at the pie judge, a wiry guy in a flannel shirt who'd been waving a scorecard like he was king of the goddamn world. Nacho's jaws clamped around his throat before the man could even scream. Blood sprayed in a hot arc, splattering the pies and the faces of the contestants still frozen at the table. The judge's scream finally came, but it was wet and garbled, cut short as Nacho shook his head violently, tearing flesh like it was tissue paper. The crowd erupted into chaos, kids shrieking, parents shoving each other to run, teenagers dropping their cigarettes as they bolted for the corn maze. "Oh yeah, baby!" Nacho howled, his muzzle dripping red. He spat out a chunk of gristle and dove back in, ripping at the judge's chest with feral glee. "This is my fucking jam!" Snort ignored the pandemonium, his focus razor sharp. He dragged one blood-slicked paw through the mess on the table, carving jagged, glowing runes into the wood. The air grew heavy, thick with the stench of iron and something older, darker. The pumpkins lining the stage, carved with goofy grins and triangle eyes, began to pulse with a sickly orange light. Their jagged mouths twitched, then widened, as if they were waking up. "Tonight," Snort growled, his voice carrying over the screams, "this festival is mine." The pumpkins moved, not rolled, moved. Their vines lashed out like whips, snaring ankles and dragging people to the ground. One jack-o'-lantern, its face twisted into a snarl, sank its teeth into a fleeing woman's leg, crunching through bone. She screamed until her voice broke, and the pumpkin kept chewing. Another launched itself at a man trying to shield his kid, its glowing maw clamping onto his arm and tearing it clean off. Blood painted the ground, mixing with spilled cider and crushed candy. Nacho was in his element, darting through the chaos like a demon on a bender. He leaped onto a fleeing teenager, sinking his teeth into the kid's calf and dragging him down. "Run faster next time, you fat fuck!" he cackled, before bounding off to chase a woman who tripped over a hay bale. He didn't kill her, just tore a chunk out of her thigh and kept going, laughing like a maniac as she screamed. Snort stood on the table, unmoving, his eyes glowing brighter as the runes pulsed in time with the blood moon. The air crackled with dark energy, and the screams of the crowd blended into a symphony of terror. He licked a smear of blood from his paw, savoring the coppery tang. "This," he muttered, "is a good fucking start." By the time the moon reached its zenith, the festival was a slaughterhouse. Bodies littered the ground, some still twitching as pumpkins gnawed on their limbs. The corn maze was a tangle of blood and trampled stalks, and the air was thick with the stench of death. Nacho rolled in a puddle of blood, his fur matted and sticky, his eyes wide with unhinged joy. "This is the best night of my life!" he shrieked, kicking his legs in the air like a kid in a candy store. "We're gods, Snort! Fucking gods!" Snort stepped down from the table, his paws leaving bloody prints on the wood. He surveyed the carnage with a cold satisfaction, his tongue swiping over his jowls. "Next year," he said, his voice calm but laced with menace. Nacho's head whipped around, his grin so wide it looked painful. "Fuck next year!" he screamed, scrambling to his feet. "Let's finish the job tomorrow! There's a whole town out there, Snort! More throats, more blood, more everything!" Snort's eyes gleamed, and for the first time that night, he smiled, a slow, predatory curl of his lips. "You're not wrong," he said. "This is just the beginning." And that's where the nightmare really began. Chapter 2. The survivors' mourning in Briar Hollow didn't break so much as it crawled, limping over the horizon like a wounded animal. The sun rose, weak and pale, casting a sickly light across streets that were too quiet, too still. The festival grounds were a slaughterhouse frozen in time, blood-soaked grass pressed flat where people had trampled each other in blind panic, trying to escape the impossible. Shattered jack-o'-lanterns littered the ground, their carved faces smeared with gore, some still twitching faintly as if reluctant to let go of whatever dark force had animated them. The air reeked of iron and decay, undercut by the faint, cloying sweetness of spilled cider and crushed candy apples. It was a graveyard pretending to be a town, and nobody was ready for what it meant. Sheriff Dan Lewis stood at the edge of the carnage, his boots sinking into the muddy, blood-slicked earth. 20 years on the job, dead deer on highways, bar fights that left broken noses and busted teeth, even that freak chainsaw accident back in '09 that had haunted his dreams for months, none of it had prepared him for this. There were no clean bodies to tag, no neat chalk outlines, just pieces. A severed hand still clutching a corn dog. A torso ripped open like a piñata, guts spilling out in ropes. A head half gnawed like a fucking apple, staring blankly at the sky with one eye missing. Dan's stomach churned, and he tore off his sheriff's hat, rubbing his weathered face with a trembling hand. "Jesus fucking Christ," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. From behind him came a sharp, barking laugh that grated like broken glass. Dan spun around, hand twitching toward his holster, to find Father Riley staggering toward him, a half-empty bottle of whiskey dangling from his fingers. The ex-priest's cassock was stained with sweat and booze, his bloodshot eyes wild with a mix of terror and vindication. "You think Jesus had anything to do with this?" Riley slurred, stumbling closer, his breath sour and hot. "No, Sheriff, this wasn't no divine intervention. This was evil. Real, honest to God, rip your fucking soul out evil. I told you all about the blood moon. I told you something was coming. But did anybody listen to the drunk old priest? Fuck no." Dan's jaw tightened, his patience fraying like an old rope. "What I think," he said, his voice low and sharp, "is that somebody spiked the cider with some bad shit, and a whole lot of people got torn up in the panic. Maybe dogs got loose, maybe wolves from the hills. I don't know yet, but I'm not jumping to your apocalyptic bullshit, Riley." Riley's laugh turned into a snarl, and he jabbed a shaky finger at Dan's chest. "You're a fucking idiot, Lewis. Wolves? You think wolves carved runes into that table? You think wolves made pumpkins eat people? Ask the kids. Ask the survivors. They saw it. They saw the dogs."
He took a swig from his bottle, whiskey dribbling down his chin. Glowing eyes. Talking. Fucking talking.
You gonna explain that with your bad cider theory? Dan's eyes narrowed, but he didn't answer. He turned away, his boots crunching through the debris as he walked toward the fire station. Riley's words gnawed at him, but he shoved them down. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let a washed-up priest's ravings derail him. Outside the fire station, 16-year-old Maddie Torres sat on the curb, her knees pulled tight to her chest. Her skeleton costume was torn and crusted with dried blood, the black and white face paint smudged into a grotesque mask of streaks and smears. Her dark hair hung in matted clumps, and her eyes were glassy, staring at nothing. She hadn't spoken since they'd found her last night, curled up in the corn maze, surrounded by bodies. The paramedics had checked her for injuries, but physically, she was fine. Mentally, Dan wasn't so sure. He crouched in front of her, his knees creaking, and softened his voice as much as he could. "Maddie," he said gently, "we need to know what you saw. Anything you can tell us, anything at all, it could help." Her eyes snapped up to his, wide and terrified, like she'd just woken from a nightmare only to find it was real. Her lips trembled, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from screaming. "It was a pug." Dan blinked, caught off guard. "A pug?" "And a Chihuahua," she added, her voice shaking like a leaf in a storm. "But they weren't normal. Their eyes were glowing, like fire, orange fire." "The pug talked. It said—" She swallowed hard, her hands clutching her knees so tightly her knuckles went white. "It said we belonged to him, that the festival was his. And then—" She broke off, her whole body shivering violently, like she was trying to shake the memory out of her skin. Dan leaned closer, his voice steady but urgent. "Then what, Maddie? What happened next?" Her eyes darted around, as if the dogs might be lurking nearby, listening. "They laughed," she whispered. "They laughed while it happened. The pug, it just stood there, watching, like it was proud. The Chihuahua was everywhere, tearing into people, screaming like it was having fun. And the pumpkins," her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands. "The pumpkins came alive. They had teeth. They ate people. I saw them eat my brother." Dan's stomach dropped. He wanted to tell her it was shock, that her mind was playing tricks, but the raw terror in her eyes stopped him. He placed a hand on her shoulder, awkward but trying to comfort her. "You're safe now, Maddie. We're gonna figure this out." She didn't look like she believed him. Hell, he didn't believe himself. By nightfall, Briar Hollow was a ghost town. Doors were bolted, windows boarded, lights off. Every house was a fortress, every resident armed with whatever they could find: shotguns, hunting rifles, kitchen knives, baseball bats. The mayor had issued a curfew, and the streets were empty, save for the occasional patrol car sweeping its lights across the darkness. The blood moon was gone, replaced by a cold silver sliver that did little to pierce the heavy fog rolling in from the hills. The town held its breath, waiting. It didn't help. Snort and Nacho were already out there, prowling the silent streets, their claws clicking softly on the asphalt. Snort moved with deliberate menace, his stocky frame low to the ground, his glowing orange eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. The air was thick with the scent of fear, sweat, adrenaline, the faint metallic tang of blood still lingering from the festival. "God, I love the smell of fear," Snort growled, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the pavement. "It's like fucking perfume." Nacho, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of unhinged energy, darting back and forth across the street, sniffing mailboxes, barking at shadows, and giggling like a maniac. His fur was still matted with dried blood from the night before, and his eyes glowed a sickly yellow, wild and unfocused. "There's someone in that house!" he squeaked, skidding to a stop in front of a 2-story colonial with boarded windows. "I can smell them! Sweaty, scared, probably pissing themselves! Let's eat 'em, Snort! Let's eat their fucking face off!" "Not yet," Snort snapped, his curly tail twitching. "We pick them off one by one. Make it last. You go in guns blazing, they'll all hide deeper, and we'll have to dig them out. I want them to feel it coming." Nacho whined, bouncing on his paws. "You're so fucking slow, man!" "I'm starving. I need to rip something apart. I need to taste the squish." He snapped his jaws at the air, his teeth clacking loudly. "Come on, just one. That house smells like barbecue sauce and regret. Perfect combo." Snort ignored him, his eyes locked on a flicker of movement down the street. A figure, barely visible in the fog, was creeping along the sidewalk, a flashlight beam wobbling in his hand. Snort's lips curled back, revealing those unnatural, razor-sharp teeth. "There," he said, "first course." The mailman, Jerry Whitaker, was the first unlucky bastard. He shouldn't have been out this late, not after the mayor's curfew. But Jerry was old school, the kind of guy who took his job too seriously. He'd heard noises near the mailboxes on Elm Street. Probably kids messing around again, he'd thought. Vandals trying to steal packages or spray paint dicks on the boxes. He'd grabbed his flashlight and a crowbar, figuring he'd scare them off. Poor fucker never saw them coming. Snort moved first, silent and swift despite his stocky build. He launched himself from the shadows, slamming into Jerry's chest with enough force to knock him flat on his back. The flashlight skittered across the pavement, its beam spinning wildly. Jerry's scream was cut short as Snort's teeth sank into his stomach, tearing through his uniform and flesh like they were paper. Blood sprayed, hot and thick, soaking Snort's fur as he ripped deeper, intestines spilling out in a wet, glistening pile. Nacho didn't wait for an invitation. He went straight for Jerry's face, his tiny body a blur of frenzied motion. His jaws snapped shut on the mailman's nose, cartilage crunching as he tore it off with a savage shake of his head. "Fuck yeah! Postage paid, motherfucker!" Nacho screamed, his voice shrill and gleeful, blood dripping from his muzzle as he dove back in, biting and tearing at Jerry's cheeks, his eyes, anything he could reach. The mailman's screams turned to gurgles, then silence, as Nacho's teeth found his throat. It was over in seconds. What was left of Jerry wasn't recognizable, just a mangled heap of flesh and shredded blue fabric. Snort stepped back, licking blood from his jowls, his glowing eyes calm and satisfied. Nacho, still buzzing with adrenaline, dragged Jerry's corpse toward a big blue mailbox on the corner. With a manic giggle, he started stuffing the remains inside, shoving with his paws until the body was wedged in, one arm dangling limply through the slot, fingers twitching in the cold air. Nacho stood back, panting, his tail wagging furiously. "Special delivery, bitch!" he cackled, hopping in place. "Next day shipping to fucking hell!" Snort snorted, a rare flicker of amusement crossing his face. "You're a fucking lunatic," he said, but there was no real venom in it. He turned, his eyes scanning the street for the next target. Come on, night's young. By morning, the town was awake and screaming. A jogger had found the mailbox, the arm, the trail of tiny blood-soaked paw prints leading into the fog. Word spread like wildfire, and by noon, half of Briar Hollow had gathered in the town square, their faces pale, their voices a mix of panic and disbelief. The mayor, still red-faced and sweating despite the chill, stood on a makeshift platform, shouting into a megaphone. "This is domestic terrorism," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "Some sick bastard is out there, using animals to scare us. We're locking down the town, setting up patrols, and we will find whoever's responsible." Father Riley, leaning against a lamppost with his flask in hand, laughed bitterly. Terrorism? No, you fat fuck. This is hell. You can't shoot hell. You can't arrest it. Those dogs, they're not animals. They're something else. He took a long swig, his eyes glinting with a mix of fear and defiance. I told you. I fucking told you all. The crowd muttered, some nodding, others shaking their heads, but the fear was universal. Sheriff Dan stood at the edge of the square, loading his shotgun with grim determination. He didn't believe in Riley's demons, not yet, but he'd seen the mailbox. He'd seen the paw prints, and he'd seen Maddie Torres's eyes when she talked about the pug. Watch me, he muttered, snapping the shotgun closed. I'll shoot whatever the fuck they are. But deep down, Dan knew the truth was slipping out of his grasp. The air felt wrong, heavy with something he couldn't name. And somewhere out there, in the fog-choked streets, Snort and Nacho were waiting, their hunger far from sated. Chapter 3. The Harvest. Briar Hollow didn't sleep. Not a fucking wink. The town was a coiled spring, ready to snap under the weight of its own dread. Families huddled in their living rooms, shotguns across their laps, fingers twitching on triggers as they stared at locked doors. Preachers and atheists alike clutched rosaries or whispered prayers to gods they weren't sure existed anymore. A few packed their cars with whatever they could grab, clothes, canned food, family photos, and peeled out of town, tires screeching, headlights cutting through the fog like desperate screams. But the ones who stayed? They heard it. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of leaves outside, every shadow that moved too slow. And then, worse, the sounds that didn't belong. The scratching of claws on wood, the sharp yipping bark that sounded too much like laughter, and worst of all, the low, guttural chuckle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of blood and rotting pumpkins, and the fog clung to the streets like a shroud. Briar Hollow wasn't a town anymore. It was a trap, and the ones who stayed were the bait. Out by the old pumpkin patch on the edge of town, where the soil was black and the vines grew wild, Snort stood atop a mound of dirt, his squat pug body silhouetted against the blood moon's sickly red glow. His fur was matted with blood and dirt, his curly tail rigid, and his glowing orange eyes burned like twin furnaces, casting an eerie light across the gnarled field. The air around him crackled with something ancient, something wrong, as if the earth itself was holding its breath.
Nacho, as usual, was losing his goddamn mind. The Chihuahua pranced around the base of the mound, his tiny paws splashing in puddles of blood from some earlier unseen kill. His yellow eyes gleamed with manic glee, and his tongue lolled out, dripping red. "Ready, boss?" he squeaked, his voice shrill enough to shatter glass. "We gonna fuck this town up or what? I'm so pumped I could chew through a fucking car." He spun in a tight circle, yipping and giggling, his tail wagging so hard it looked like it might fly off. Snort's eyes didn't waver from the moon, his expression cold and focused. "Oh, I've been ready since the first fucking dog catcher tossed me in the pound," he growled, his voice low and thick, like gravel dragged through tar. "This town's been begging for a reckoning. Tonight, we give it to 'em." He lowered his head, his stubby legs bracing against the dirt, and began to growl, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through the ground. The growl shifted, twisting into something unnatural, words forming in a guttural chant that didn't belong to any human language. The air grew colder, sharper, and the blood moon pulsed brighter, casting jagged shadows that writhed like living things. Beneath Snort's paws, the earth shuddered and split, a jagged crack tearing open with a sound like breaking bones. From the fissure came writhing roots, black and slick, twisting into grotesque shapes, claws, faces, hands, before burrowing back into the soil. The pumpkins in the patch began to move. Some bulged, their rinds splitting open like cracked skulls to reveal glowing, grinning faces, their carved eyes blazing with the same orange light as Snort's. Others rolled across the ground like severed heads, leaving trails of blood and pulp. A few sprouted vine arms, long and sinuous, tipped with thorns that glistened like obsidian. The worst ones grew mouths, gaping, jagged maws lined with bark-like teeth that snapped at the air, hungry for flesh. Nacho lost it, bouncing in frenzied circles around the mound, his barks turning into a high-pitched cackle. "Fuck yes! Halloween is fucking back!" he screamed, snapping his jaws at a vine that lashed too close. "Look at these beautiful bastards! They're gonna eat this town alive!" He dove at a pumpkin, biting into its rind and tearing off a chunk, spitting it out with a gleeful yip. "Let's fucking go, Snort!" Snort's lips curled into a grim smile, his chant fading as the patch came fully alive, a writhing, glowing nightmare of vines and teeth. "Let's," he said, and leapt down from the mound, his paws hitting the ground with a wet thud. Bobby Jenkins was too drunk to give a shit about the warnings. The mayor's curfew, the sheriff's patrols, the whispered stories about talking dogs and killer pumpkins, it was all bullshit to him. Small-town hysteria fueled by bad cider and worse imaginations. He'd spent the night at his cousin's barn party, knocking back warm beers and homemade moonshine until the world spun. Now he was stumbling home along the back roads, his boots scuffing the gravel, a half-smoked cigarette dangling from his lips. The fog was thick, curling around him like a living thing. But Bobby didn't notice the air shift, didn't feel the suffocating silence that settled over the road like a noose. Then he saw it. A single pumpkin sitting dead center in the middle of the road, its carved face a crude, lopsided grin that seemed to leer at him. It was small, no bigger than a basketball, its orange rind streaked with dirt. Bobby squinted, swaying on his feet. "The fuck is this?" he muttered, his voice slurred. He staggered closer, gave the pumpkin a sloppy kick, expecting it to roll into the ditch. It didn't. The pumpkin split open with a wet, ripping sound, and a mass of black, thorny vines exploded outward, wrapping around Bobby's legs like steel cables. He hit the ground hard, his cigarette flying, his scream sharp and panicked as the vines tightened, thorns slicing into his jeans and skin. "What the fuck?" he yelled, thrashing, his hands clawing at the gravel. More vines shot out, lashing around his arms, his chest, one coiling around his throat and squeezing until his screams turned to choked gasps. Snort emerged from the fog, trotting calmly out of the shadows, his head tilted as he studied Bobby's writhing form. His glowing eyes burned through the haze, and his voice was a low, mocking growl. "Trick or treat, you drunk fuck!" Bobby's eyes bulged, his voice a hoarse croak. What the hell are you?" Snort didn't answer. He just watched as the vines dragged Bobby toward the pumpkin patch, his body scraping across the gravel, leaving a trail of blood and torn fabric. The last thing Bobby saw was the patch itself, dozens of pumpkins, their glowing faces twisted into snarls, their vines writhing like a nest of snakes. One pumpkin, larger than the rest, opened its mouth wide, and Bobby's scream was cut off as it clamped down on his torso, teeth crunching through bone and muscle. Blood sprayed, and the patch swallowed what was left of him, piece by screaming piece. By the time it was over, there wasn't enough to identify, just a few scraps of flannel and a single bloody boot left in the road. Nacho bounded out of the patch, his muzzle smeared with fresh blood, his eyes wild with delight. "Holy shit! That was awesome!" he shrieked, spinning in a circle. "Did you see his face? He was all, 'Oh no, my legs!' And then crunch, fucking crunch!" He laughed, a high-pitched, unhinged sound, and licked his chops. "Who's next, boss? I'm ready for seconds!" Snort's tail twitched, his eyes scanning the horizon.
"Plenty to go around," he said. "Let's move."
Sheriff Dan Lewis wasn't a man who backed down. He'd faced down drunks, poachers, even a meth head with a machete once, and he'd never blinked. But as he stood behind the barricades on Main Street, his hands sweaty on the grip of his shotgun, he felt something he hadn't in years: fear. The street was a fortress, barricades of parked cars and plywood, deputies armed with rifles and shotguns, even a goddamn flamethrower borrowed from the volunteer fire department, its tank glinting in the streetlights. The fog was thick, curling around the barricades like ghostly fingers, and the air was heavy with the promise of violence. "Stay sharp," Dan barked, his voice steady despite the knot in his gut. "Whatever's out there, we put it down. No hesitation." Deputy Ramirez, a wiry kid who'd only been on the force a year, shifted nervously, his rifle shaking. "You think it's really dogs, Sheriff, like the girl said?" Dan's jaw tightened. "I don't know what it is, Ramirez, but it bleeds, we kill it." Then they heard it, the faint, unmistakable jingle of a collar, like a bell tolling in the fog. Every head snapped toward the sound, weapons raised, hearts pounding. Snort appeared first, walking calmly down the center of the street, his fur matted with dried blood, his glowing eyes cutting through the haze like searchlights. Nacho trotted behind him, his tiny frame vibrating with manic energy, a human jawbone clamped in his teeth, blood dripping from the jagged end. "Evening, boys," Snort said, his voice low and gravelly, dripping with mockery. He stopped a dozen yards from the barricades, his head tilted, his lips curled into a smirk. "Put the guns down, and maybe we let you live till dawn." Dan's blood ran cold, but he didn't hesitate. He raised his shotgun and fired, the blast echoing through the silent street. The bullet whizzed past Snort's ear, grazing his fur, and for a split second, Dan thought he'd hit him. Then the ground exploded. Pumpkin vines erupted from the asphalt, cracking the street like it was glass. They lashed out with terrifying speed, wrapping around the barricades, splintering wood, and flipping cars like toys. "Evening, boys," Snort said, his voice low and gravelly, dripping with mockery. He stopped a dozen yards from the barricades, his head tilted, his lips curled into a smirk. "Put the guns down, and maybe we let you live till dawn." Dan's blood ran cold, but he didn't hesitate. He raised his shotgun and fired, the blast echoing through the silent street. The bullet whizzed past Snort's ear, grazing his fur, and for a split second, Dan thought he'd hit him. Then the ground exploded. Pumpkin vines erupted from the asphalt, cracking the street like it was glass. They lashed out with terrifying speed, wrapping around the barricades, splintering wood, and flipping cars like toys. One deputy screamed as a vine snared his ankle, yanking him into the air before dragging him into the darkness, his screams fading into wet, crunching sounds. Another vine coiled around Ramirez's rifle, ripping it from his hands and snapping his arm like a twig. He fell, clutching the broken limb, his screams drowned out by the chaos. Nacho leapt into the fray, landing on Deputy Harris's chest with a gleeful squeal. "Look at me, you fucking coward!" he screamed, his teeth sinking into Harris's face, tearing through flesh and cartilage. Blood sprayed, and Harris's screams turned to gurgles as Nacho ripped at his eyes, his nose, his lips, laughing like a maniac the whole time. "Look at me!" Dan roared, igniting the flamethrower with a whoosh of fire. He swept the nozzle across the street, turning the writhing vines into a wall of flame. Pumpkins screamed, high, unnatural shrieks, as their rinds blackened and burst. The heat was blistering, the smoke choking, but Snort didn't flinch. He stood in the middle of the inferno, his glowing eyes locked on Dan, his grin wide and predatory through the haze. "You just made this fun," Snort said, his voice cutting through the roar of the flames like a knife. And then he was gone, vanishing into the fog as if he'd never been there. By sunrise, Briar Hollow was a graveyard. The streets were silent, the fog burned away to reveal a town transformed into a nightmare. Bodies, or pieces of them, hung from streetlights like grotesque Halloween decorations, swaying in the breeze. A torso dangled from a stop sign, its ribs cracked open like a cage. A severed arm was impaled on a fence post, fingers still curled as if reaching for help. Pumpkins lined the sidewalks, each carved with a different expression, screaming, crying, laughing. Some still dripping with fresh blood, their vines twitching faintly in the morning light. At the center of town, nailed to the doors of City Hall, was Sheriff Dan's badge, its metal stained with rust and gore. Below it, scrawled in blood that was still wet, were the words, "See you next year, bitches." The few survivors who dared to leave their homes whispered among themselves, their voices trembling. The dogs were gone, for now, but the pumpkin patch was still out there, its vines curling deeper into the earth, waiting. And somewhere, in the shadows, Snort and Nacho were already planning their next feast.